Are we recording? Okay, thank you so much for that. So I would like to welcome you. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this online seminar presented by Professor Raphael Heffron on strategic risk in decision-making in the just transition to a low-carbon economy. My name is Tracy-Lynn Field, and I'm a Professor of Law here at Wits University, and also the Claude Leon Chair in Earth Justice and Stewardship. So Professor Heffron is no stranger to Wits. We had the pleasure of him visiting our institution in July, where he gave a very engaging and interesting discussion on publishing in top-tier ranked multidisciplinary journals, and also participated in a high-level dialogue on universal enabling electricity access with a number of NGOs. So Professor Heffron is one of the world's leading experts on energy law and sustainability. He has bachelor's and master's degrees from the Trinity College Dublin and the University of St. Andrews. He also holds an MSc in taxation from the University of Oxford and an MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge. He's a qualified Barrister of Laws at the Honourable Society of King's Inns. And he has held research and teaching positions at several institutions across the world, including MIT, the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, the University of Cambridge, University of Stirling, University of Leeds, Premier University, the University of Dundee, University of West Indies, and he is currently a professor at the University of Pau and Ado countries in France. He has over 200 publications and is recognized as one of the most cited scholars in his field, which is energy law, energy justice, and the just transition. His work has reached a global audience through being translated into multiple languages, and he has delivered over 220 keynote addresses across 64 countries. He is ranked among the top 2% of scientists worldwide, according to the prestigious Elsevier-Stanford rankings. Raphael, it's an absolute pleasure to have you again with us today. Thank you for your time and for being willing to share with us this important topic. We'll be looking at the intersections between just energy transition, technology, the perpetual cycle of being left behind or missing out, and the strategic choices that are really faced by every single stakeholder, be that governments, companies, or citizens. So with that, I would like to hand over to you, please, for the online seminar today. And Professor Heffron will be presenting for about 45 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. So if you would like to post your questions in the chat in the meantime, while the lectures are going, I will keep track of those, or we will have a time at the end for people to pose questions orally. Thank you. And over to you, Raphael.
Thank you. And thank you very much to you and your team for organizing this, and also for the great welcome that I had back in July. So today what we are talking about is strategic risk in decision-making in the transition to in the just transition to a low-carbon economy. And the essence really of what I'm trying to let's say talk about today is really around that decision-making process. And let's say for many of the lawyers who are listening today, and also those interested in policy making and other disciplines, that really the challenge that we face in this climate and energy transition is around the transformation of our decision making. And I'll hope to bring you on a journey around how we need to evolve our decision making today, and let's say some of the different pressures, the different challenges that are impacting on how we make a decision today. So I think Tracy's given an extensive introduction, so I won't say too much more. but just that the point raised in terms of my work is in the top 2% of scientists of any discipline. So this is showing you that this issue of justice is crossing over into all disciplines. And this is something that I will come back to at the end. But equally, I just wanted to highlight some papers that I had published, let's say, within the last year. And they just give a flavor of maybe why decision-making, why strategic thinking in this move to a just energy and climate transition are very important. So you can see here one on ESG investing, and we were thinking about the idea of ethics, and this paper was written with a range of engineers, economists, political science, but that idea of, you know, normally ethics is more, and something around justice is more the focus of legal research, but you can see it's crossed over into other disciplines. Again, a paper written with researchers from the ASEAN Center for Energy, which is a research unit essentially of the ASEAN Secretariat. And again, crossing into policymaking, again, they're interested in this idea of justice. And then finally, the other one, where we're exploring the issue of the energy transition in petrostates, and that's written with political science and public policy researchers. And again, you know, the focus there being on the issue of the just transition and, you know, that role of justice. And again, you know, these are all other researchers who want to learn more, research in depth on the issue of a just transition. So you should keep that in mind. And I suppose one of the key reasons why this has become a very big issue is because we can see the figure here that if we are to advance in this energy transition, we need around $75 trillion worth of new energy infrastructure by 2040. And remember, some of this is created not just because we need 75 trillion worth of new clean energy infrastructure, but we also need energy infrastructure because of rising demand and also to replace existing old energy infrastructure that, you know, should not be operational anymore. But we need this 75 trillion. And part of this is the challenge, let's say, for society is to make sure that we spend this money in a just way, that we are improving outcomes for society. And the idea here centers very much on the fact that we have not been getting things right. We need to change the approach that we have. People refer to this as a business as usual approach. We need to change that and evolve the relationship. So in a very simple way, you can see here, we're trying to evolve the relationship between the three key stakeholders: government, companies, or if you like, the private sector, and civil society. They are the three key stakeholders of society. And what we want to see is the issue of risk, reward, and responsibility being more balanced, that relationship between those being more balanced. And I'll give you the easiest example. When you think about the rewards of the energy sector, so who's making the profit, let's say, from extracting energy or mineral resources, we know today it's mainly, let's say, the private sector, the companies. And we can see various initiatives around trying to improve that relationship around reward. We see the increasing calls for a major overhaul of international taxation and the whole system of how it works. You can see that with the OECD BEPS initiative. And that is probably the easiest example. And we also see, let's say, in many countries around the world, you can see it in the discipline of in economics, the move to address the fundamental problem of inequality in our society, and how even, let's say, over the last 10 to 15 years, in many universities, they've been transforming the curricula in economics to address this issue of inequality. So we see calls for that reward of the energy sector to be shared more. We see the issue of risk being shared more, that often people would say that a lot of the risk is left to civil society. They experience the, let's say, effects or impacts of the operations of the energy sector. And again, responsibility. Who takes responsibility? Let's say our regulators, governments taking responsibility, our companies. You see, again, initiatives around corporate social responsibility, again, highlighting those issues, as well as a focus on local communities and ensuring that local communities participate as well. So there are multiple issues here when we think of addressing this relationship. But the idea is we are trying to improve the relationship on risk, reward, and responsibility in terms of energy activities. And the question you could ask is, why should we change? And I want to give some examples of, let's say, why we should change. And part of this comes, every year we advance our thoughts at the COP conference, the UN COP conference, and you can follow what the latest advancements will be at COP29 next month. And you can also refer back to, let's say, what was a really informative document of where the UN want to go, the direction they want to go. And I suppose this addresses some of the issues around the ongoing climate impacts, the environmental impacts, but also issues around, this was post-COVID, so the experience of different type of, let's say, economic or health shocks to our economy. And the idea is that we need to future-proof our decision-making in the energy sector. We need to have this forward-thinking approach. We can no longer, let's say, pretend that the cheapest form of energy is the best, or that different types of energy are going to result in a type of economic development that benefits everyone. We have the evidence to show that different types of energy lead to greater societal inequality, lead to greater environmental impact. And I just highlight one of the papers, which I'll discuss in more detail in a minute, that I contributed to, again, with other scholars from other disciplines, where we talked about that shift in accountability and responsibility in the energy sector. So that idea that we need to become more accountable, and how is that going to change in the future? So one of the ways that that is going to change into the future is around this concept of future-proofing. And the idea, there are two elements of future-proofing to explain to you. The first, very simply, is that if you are in a public office or you are in a corporate office, the idea that comes from, that you can infer from this United Nations work, is that you would be what lawyers would refer to as contributory negligent, that you could no longer hide behind your office, your political office or your corporate office, that you would have to show, that you made a very clear and comprehensive decision at a particular time. So you can see here in a sort of more simplistic definition, the idea that in future, you would be able to say that, let's say today, you would be able to say that back in 2020, you made a decision based on the best scientific data, the best risk management strategy, the best environmental impact data. You had considered different alternatives in your decision. And with all of these, you informed your decision making and you made the best decision possible at that time. And you were able to essentially to provide evidence that you had made that best possible decision. And, you know, I say it in terms of we could hold people who held political office and also corporate office, but you could see this diffusing down into a range of other, you know, offices in the private or public sector as well, that this allocation of responsibility on decision makers to basically seek out more information. And we should remember there is more and more information available today. So that leads me into my second point, and to think about what is decision making guided by today. And we can see that very much, if we look today, we think of the Paris Agreement and the influence of when justice, let's say a just transition, received a first mention. We can think of it how it has evolved essentially. And really it has evolved around this triple societal challenge that I would like to refer to. And this is also why policymakers across the world have really begun to engage in the concept. It's also why investors across the world have really engaged with the concept. And to give you an example, I mentioned that UN COP29 is coming up. If you look at any position statement of any bank, international institution, government, before they announce this is our plan when we're going to COP29, I guarantee you will see mention of the just transition or the just energy transition within this policy pre-COP29 policy statement. But some of the reasons we see, or the three, reasons for policymakers to really engage, have been that this is about addressing inequality. You know, one of the reasons that a country can continue to have lower economic growth is because you're not addressing the societal inequality issue. You can actually, economists have shown, by having greater societal equality, that you should expect higher economic growth over time. Also, in terms of switching to clean technology, you know, this again is about a switch in technology, essentially a technology revolution. There's no point trying to hang on to the technology of the past. The new technology is getting cheaper and cheaper. And just to give you two examples, which are well documented in the literature, offshore wind has come down in price by 80%. I think over a period of 10 years, the UK reduced the price of offshore wind by 80%. In India, over an equivalent period of around 10 years, they also reduced the price of solar energy by around 80% too. And bearing in mind, in both the UK and in India, they do purchase the majority of the different components of a wind turbine or the solar panels from other countries. So imagine being able to get that price down. The prices are coming down considerably. Also, clean energy sources are becoming more attractive as we build into the cost of coal or oil or gas. We build into the cost the impact of carbon, and we advance more on various carbon taxation mechanisms. The third big societal challenge is really the impacts of climate change. And again, you can see in some of the latest research today that if we do nothing about the energy and climate transition, this will actually cost us more money in terms of doing nothing than if we actually begin to take this seriously and excuse me, and invest in the energy and climate transition, invest in this clean technology, invest in energy efficiency, invest in innovation around this area. And one of the reasons we can see is the ongoing impacts of climate change, where the costs of doing business are going up because issues like insurance are going up. Certain parts of the community are no longer able to be insured. Also, we see the impact on jobs due to climate change. We see the impact on different countries in terms of relocation of populations, in terms of the relocation even of different towns, and now we see the relocation of different cities. So as we advance towards 2030 and 2050, this has become not just an issue for discussion, it has become an issue that policymakers see. Essentially, all parts of the society do not want to be left behind. This is the essence of the just transition, to not leave anyone behind, whether it is civil society, the private sector, or, let's say different governments around the world. And this is, these three reasons are fundamental and understandable to each part of our society. So, well, one way we can think about this is that, when we think about decision making, we need to have our decision making governed by a set of principles. There needs to be some standards that we operate to. And I just want to highlight some of these principles that are now being used to essentially, govern decision making, or they are now becoming part of that, as I referred to it at the start, that strategic decision making in the energy sector, or more broadly as we move to a just transition to a low carbon economy. And you can see this in the United States, Colombia, South Africa. I've ticked off, marked with an X, different principles these countries are using in their decision making. And these are in documents that are, let's say, influential in terms of the energy and climate transition that these countries face. So if we touch on them in a bit more detail, what are these principles that are guiding the decision making? We see distributive, which is really connected with the finance system. And that goes back to that idea of reward. When I talked about risk, reward, and responsibility, you need a more fair distributive system that delivers rewards to the different stakeholders in a more fair way. Procedural is about the legal system, or the legal architecture of what we have today to deliver, let's say responsibility or the risk. Restorative is about correcting and preventing injustices in the system. So where we see some of the impacts, how do we correct the impacts, or how do we prevent them in future? So very much about that risk part of that relationship. Recognition and cosmopolitan are about the who, recognition about who nationally or even locally. Cosmopolitan is about who internationally, those cross-border issues, or maybe even regional issues within a country itself. But we think about those issues as who, so who is involved, who are the key stakeholders in any decision. Essentially, as I said, when we think about risk, reward, and responsibility, for any decision, you should be thinking about who is part of that particular decision. And are you thinking about, let's say, their strategic direction as you make your decision? So we see in the US, just to highlight a that they use this in what they refer to as the Justice 40 initiative, and they were aiming to distribute around 62 billion worth of investment. They gave definitions for procedure, distributive, recognition, restorative, and if you like, these are working definitions where you can move forward. And the idea here is that when I say that earlier that you are trying to future-proof a decision, it's not that someone is expecting you to have the purest definition of each type of principle or the purest of data. What they are saying is that you should be able to say that this is the working definition you took at this particular time, and that you aim to use this in your decision making. So you're providing evidence and you're showing the logic of how you made your decision. And that's the idea within this US in this Justice 40 initiative, that you're aiming to show these working definitions. And very interestingly, they took these directly from research articles, and you can read some of these, let's say, online yourself, but they're just taking them directly from research. And I suppose for me, what I see in this is that we're really thinking of, in the past, we would think about this issue of, how far should we go in a decision? And what we are seeing here is that you really have to be pushing the boundaries of decision making. You can no longer see your decision in isolation. If you take, let's say, coal out of the ground, for example, there will be consequences later on. There will be waste management and decommissioning problems. There will be, some type of carbon taxation. There could be water pollution. And the idea here is that in order to future-proof your decision, you should be factoring in where in this sort of energy life cycle your decision is and how could it influence other decisions. Another example to give you would be, if you're talking about energy prices in terms of operation and supply, you're supplying electricity for the fourth activity there, consumption, for let's say, civil society to consume. What you have to think about is, well, if you give subsidies at the extractive level to coal, or, for example, you have no carbon tax on coal, then it's an unfair market for solar and wind because they don't have the same advantage of having these subsidies. They're not getting the same support. So actually there's a price distortion. So if you're deciding, a decision maker deciding on carbon taxation or even extraction, these are issues you want to be thinking about in terms of this more balanced decision-making process and really pushing at the boundaries of what is a good decision today, what is essentially a just decision today. And that's why with some other researchers and we focused on a way of delivering what a just decision today would be. Because in terms of this UN report, which highlights this issue of future-proofing, how do you show that you were future-proofing? And we identified that in order to show that you are trying to build a, let's say, more just decision, in order to show that you are trying to bring this into your strategic decision making, that you have what we refer to as an energy justice milestone report. And we provide the essence of a toolkit here where let's say the focus is particularly on the energy sector, but you could do this more broadly for other activities, let's say, that utilize energy, but would be maybe outside solely of energy's remit. But the idea is the same, that you're looking at a periodic reporting process where you can say periodically you are updating your decision making and saying that you are trying to ensure that you have more justice within that decision making process. So one of the ideas here is, I'll just point to distributive justice. The idea here is that you have some type of taxation roadmap, that you're highlighting that, you know, you're not going to give a company who's extracting energy in your country, you're not going to give them a tax holiday for, you know, for 10 years or 15. There is going to be a slow evolution process where you will charge them more and more tax. You know, we are acknowledging here that you can't get things 100% right at the very start. But what we want to see is this journey towards having a more just decision. And the idea here is, depending on the decision, you know, the decision-making issue, like at what stage of a project is it at the planning, construction, operation, or decommissioning phase? You may be making different decisions, but the idea would be that every 3 or 5 years, you are highlighting how have you tried to improve things at the procedure level? How have you tried to improve issues at the distributive level? What have you done around restorative, recognition, and cosmopolitan? And these are all issues that all stakeholders are very concerned about. So just to give you an example, when we think about recognition justice, you know, I said recognition justice is about who is involved in a decision. And one of the key issues we see all over the world for, let's say, stopping projects when they're in construction or even in the operational phase, and these have big impacts on, let's say, investment, and a big impact on the, you know, the project developers and their investors, because these delays in the project can cause, you know, some of the projects to collapse, and obviously affect the profit of a project. So it's not just, let's say, a civil society concern anymore. There's an awareness here by all stakeholders, the government, the private sector, and civil society, of a need to change the situation. And that's why issues around recognition justice, ensuring that you know who's involved, and let's say as a project transitions from the construction phase to the operational phase to the decommissioning phase, to make sure that you are involving all the relevant stakeholders. And, you know, these are decisions that will actually benefit each of the stakeholders. So this type of toolkit becomes very relevant in terms of trying to deliver this future-proofing concept of the UN. But also what we see is that applying such a toolkit can help reduce the risk profile of a project. And remember, what happens if you can show that you're going to reduce the risk profile of a project? Well, you will get investor confidence. The more investor confidence you have, you will lower the financial costs, because you should be able to borrow the money at a lower rate, and therefore you will increase overall, you will have more jobs in the area. So it should nearly work out as a benefit to each of the stakeholders. And you can read more about this in this article that I mentioned that's available in Nature Energy, or you can email me for a copy. But a journal like that publishing on justice, it rarely is done, so it's more heavily more focused maybe on energy engineering, economics, or science. So it's good to see justice research being a focus. And, you know, while I say that we can already see justice being diffused into a lot of energy decision making, but we also are faced with some challenges where we want to see justice being applied more. So if we're looking into the next few years, and I'll touch on this very briefly towards the end, that We want to see justice infused more into areas where we can try and have more access to finance for this energy and climate transition. We want to see justice infused to the issue of debt. So how debt works to, let's say, support economies generally, but also when we think of debt being used, let's say, for foreign investment into a country, and how that, how those loans are repaid. Also into the issue of intellectual property and, let's say, the allocation of rights around intellectual property. And I suppose we saw that in, let's say, for example, in the energy and climate transition, intellectual property issues can cause a delay to rolling out good technology very fast. Whereas if you look at the health sector and COVID-19, we saw that eventually the vaccines were rolled out very fast, the technology was shared, and maybe we need to see more of that as we think about energy technology into the future. Also issues around arbitration. So how do we ensure that those rules over foreign investment and the idea of public policy within those rules is updated? So if we look at some of the decision making in recent times, we see some judges or arbitrators not taking into account the fact that public policy around climate change and how it is infused to public policy generally is not reflected really in their decision making. And that, again, we want to see the issue of justice spread or diffuse into other related areas of decision making. And let's say in the past, what we had were, you see different tools that we've, that are still being used today. But, we want to see, again, these tools that are used today upgraded to ensure that they have this issue of justice within them around professional ethics. For, let's say, most of the professions have some type of ethical standard that that the, let's say, people within that profession have to meet. We also see in the commercial space ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks being advocated for and used by different companies and within different countries. And then we have the more long-standing corporate social responsibility initiatives that still are utilized within different industries, some more than others. But we want to see these issues, let's say, evolve, or this idea of justice go in directly into the strategic decision-making processes within all these types of frameworks that I'm mentioning. And what we are going to see over the next few years, and something that all of you should follow, is within COP29, you'll see it again discussed. But over the last few years, there's been a major transformation of what the just transition means and how we are going to, let's say, develop the just transition. And last year there was a push and, let's say, a decision made for a just transition work program from 2024 to 2026. So very much this idea of, building on this UN report on future proofing. There's a link there between saying decision-making processes have to meet some type of just transition standard. And the idea here is that you'd be saying, well, normally we thought of these, the COP part, let's say if we go back to thinking about the Paris Agreement, we thought about the Paris Agreement being around reaching energy and climate targets by 2030 and by 2050. Now, today, we're thinking actually, well, how do we meet those energy and climate targets for our country in a just way? So that is the essence of this type of just transition work program, that you have all parties, or nearly all the same parties, and even some extra stakeholders involved in this work program. And the idea here is, if you were a decision maker, so you're deciding on the laws and policies in the energy sector, so you're deciding on the different incentives or regulations in the energy sector, you're a decision maker, how is that going to leave society in a just position? You know, that's what you have to be thinking about. If I make a decision today, how is that going to leave, you know, your country, the sector, in a just position in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? You have to be able to show that aim or that decision-making process. So what we can determine today is, you know, what is the role of the judiciary or the energy regulator or the ministry, you know, the various ministries involved. And the question would be, are some of the decisions they're making today, are they up to date or are they out of date? And essentially what we're asking there is, has a judge, has an energy regulator, has a ministry, have they made a decision that is future-proofed? And in that context, does it deliver a just outcome in terms of the energy and climate transition? And essentially, you will see over the next 3 years in that just transition work program, that's what essentially is being discussed. And we will also see, obviously, the role of companies and civil society. They are very much involved in this work program as well. So it's a very, very exciting time for, let's say, justice scholars to see that all of this will be discussed and deliberated on the next 3 years. And in essence, you know, my key point here is that there's essentially a responsibility on all of us to think about how justice is to be redefined. And I know there are other people who aren't just lawyers here today, but let's say for the lawyers who are here today, that, you know, in many ways, justice is now being redefined by more than just lawyers. It is no longer just the preserve of lawyers to talk about justice. And what we see is, you know, more and more that justice is being defined by a interdisciplinary or cross-sector, you know, cross-stakeholder perspectives. And this is what will make the next 3 years of this Just Transition work program very exciting. And I think it's somewhere, let's say, that, you know, even all of us today can follow and even engage with, but it's up to us to put forward, you know, different views around how justice should be considered. And just to give you an example of this, you know, just to finish off my presentation, and this is really just to highlight again that, you know, why is there a focus on this? Because this is not just a policy or civil society focus, this also has a commercial focus, because the idea here is you're reducing the risk within decision-making in the energy sector, or more broadly, as we move to a low-carbon economy. And the idea here, and, you know, to give you the US example, is you are aiming to show how you can access federal subsidies when you make a decision, and you provide how your project is going to meet these 4 justice principle criteria, how your decision making is going to be backed by these principles, and you're demonstrating how justice will be applied within the project. And you have to show the interdisciplinary and cross-professional challenges have been met. You know, you're working with the engineers, you're working with environmental scientists, you're working with economists, you're working with local communities, all together to show this is how these principles of justice will be adopted within the project, and this is how we'll deliver them. And again, it goes back to that definition of justice is changing, that there is now a new type of public policy perspective into how we should decide decisions around justice. So some final thoughts to finish on, again, follow what's going to happen in the COP conference, try and read more about this issue of future proofing. And we'll see these developments happen over the next 3 years. And for those who are able to, I think it's being able to support policymakers and those who will be going to these discussions to try and advocate for a greater type of perspective of what justice is and how it should be adopted. And the idea here with the future proofing link that I think we will greatly see is the idea of accountability, to show how you've made justice part of your decision making. And I think as researchers, we can look into that in terms of how companies, how regulators, how ministries are making decisions and begin to challenge them to see how they have made a decision and how they have tried to infuse justice as part of that decision, because in a few years, they're already going to have to show us how they did that. So we should be asking for this information sooner rather than later. And the idea here is already they should be able to provide us with evidence of how they tried to bring in justice into their strategic decision making. And I think that just finishing on this point, that is a very important issue to show in all our decision making how we try to infuse justice. So even when, for some of us as researchers, how did we try and show that the research we're doing was going to contribute in a greater way to a just transition to a low carbon economy? So I think I will finish there and look forward to any questions. And if you have any follow-ups or you want any papers, you have my email address there. And it just highlights a recent edited collection with Professor Field that's available since last month, talking about the future of just transitions. But thank you very much for listening, and happy to take the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raphael. It's really heartening to hear about the protagonism of justice and the conceptual frame you've proposed for cross-cutting framework for thinking about decision making across many spheres is very provocative and interesting. So we do have time now for questions, and there are already 2 in the chat. There are 3 in the chat actually, and I'm going to read the first one because Aisha Lotta, who posed the question, I see she has already left the chat, so I'm going to read that one out. But then I'm going to invite Penny and Andrew to put their questions to you and perhaps elaborate on what they were interested in hearing about. So Aisha Lotta asks, has contributory negligence been relied upon in specific cases against individuals in government or companies? Are there any success stories in using this future-proofing approach? So I'm going to put that there. You can also see it in the chat. And I think we can take questions in groups of 3. So Penny, are you here? Are you still with us?
I am.
Okay. All right. Penny, can you please pose your question?
Okay. So my question is, Prof, thanks very much, first of all, for your timeous contribution. We had a similar discussion on one of our groups this morning on risk and reward. I am somewhat confused, and not confused because I've done a bit of research on it, by your comments, standalone comments, that the cost of wind and solar is going down, yet nowhere in the world do we see those reduced costs reflected in costs to the final consumer. especially not residential consumers, small and medium-sized enterprise consumers, and then potentially even larger consumers when you factor in system costs as a whole. And I feel that we tend to kind of look at this in a very isolated manner, just looking at the PV and the solar costs and maybe even the battery energy storage costs coming down, but not really looking at what's happening at the system level. And then also another aspect, the financialization of the sector with the introduction of markets, where we've even seen in the EU competitiveness report, the Draghi report, reference to the financialization and trading at the trading level, where those profits are made and not really taken back down to the consumer. So I'm a bit concerned with some of the narrative on, cost reducing vis-a-vis what's actually panning out in reality. And this is not just a developing country issue. I'm actually following developed countries, and I'm seeing this all over. And I'm just wondering why there's such a push for developing countries to go the route of markets, yet not appreciating what the challenges are with markets and the ability to actually then have the tariffs reduce and the necessary benefits passed on even to the most vulnerable customers, where mostly this has been pushed back to the fiscus. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm going to abuse my position as the chair, but just to add to that, to give an example, if you look at the reduction of wind costs in the South African REI4P project, Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers, the reason why those wind costs could come down so much was because of the way it was financed. And in the later rounds, the financing came from the company's own resources, and in their process pushed out other actors who weren't able to draw on those resources. So in a way, it was a kind of, it looked like the cost was going down, but it then didn't translate into any benefits for the consumer. So I just want to add that to Penny's comment. Maybe you can take that into account. Okay, and then lastly, Andrew, are you here to pose your question? Andrew Lawrence? Hi, Andrew. Can you pose your question, please? I'm actually not sure Andrew is still here, so I'm going to read the question out. On reducing financial risk, which international actors are best placed to encourage a bigger presence and better reporting by rating agencies in Africa? And he's put a link to an article there on rating agencies in Africa. The absence of people on the ground contributes to bias against the continent. And those ratings then obviously affect the price of capital and borrowing costs. So those are three meaty questions for you, Raphael. Over to you.
So I'll answer the first one, contributing negligence. So what we have seen today is we haven't, let's say some of these cases are going through they are going through the courts still. But what we are seeing by, essentially from that UN document is a push to hold people more accountable on a personal level. And there have been several cases in the US where they are trying to hold a range of, let's say, stakeholders, usually, mainly the government, accountable for, let's say, the environmental impacts of their company. Some of those cases haven't concluded, but I expect that as we evolve over the next couple of years, I would expect those cases to conclude and there to be some, let's say, some clawback of some of the benefits, let's say the financial benefits the people received when they were in different directorships of companies to, for them to be held accountable. What we do see is some companies being held more accountable. So that is evident from many countries all over the world, that companies will be held. But I think as companies become more, they are being held more accountable in the courts. I think we are seeing companies themselves begin to think, well, they have a responsibility to the shareholder, and if they paid out essentially excessive salaries, that they want some mechanism to claw back some of those, that an executive shouldn't be able to lead a company down the wrong pathway, or a more risky pathway that didn't work out. So for me, over the next 2 to 3 years, I think you are going to see some decisions actually made where the frameworks are introduced, that judges will be able to apply more readily, and also where, let's say, the increasing capacity of judges will permit them to adopt some of these frameworks more readily than, let's say, they are now. So I would say this is a watch this space. The companies, it's not just the legal system or ministries looking at it. Companies are also thinking about it as a tool to ensure they meet stakeholder objectives, and they aren't being guided down risky pathways by executives, which will lead to big payouts later, that some of them have experienced across the world. And there is a good amount of research basically within the last 2 years which details some of those cases against companies around the world. So watch the space for the individuals being held to account, and some of those cases should conclude in the US very soon. The second question around, let's say, the issue of within electricity and of the price of the cost going down. And let's say my response to that is, yes, I would definitely agree that consumers have not benefited. And, sometimes when you, let's say, as in the EU, you create a new market for electricity trading. Well, by creating the new market for electricity trading, you've created opportunity for more different companies to enter into this trading, let's call it trading sector within the electricity sector. The more companies you have operating, the more companies who need to make a profit. So they take the profit away, and as a result, the trickle down is not really felt by the consumer. But the examples that I was referring to, and let's say where you do see a trickle down effect to the consumer, is where you have a sustained medium to long-term policy on a particular energy resource, that it is given proper medium to long-term support through different incentives being offered over a 10, 15, 20-year period, so that investors know things aren't going to change in 2 or 3 years. They know that if they keep investing in wind, such as in the UK, they will continue to be supported in different ways by the government. And equally the same case in India and several other countries that have got the cost down. So what you're looking for is a clear medium to long-term strategy on this particular energy source. But what you don't want to see at the same time is, continued support fully for other, let's say, fossil fuel energy sources. You have to, over time, you have to take out some of the support or the distorting mechanisms where you might be saying that, well, wind and solar, they need to contribute to the development of the electricity grid. So you artificially make the price high when, you know, the other sources such as coal or gas are not contributing to the electricity grid. So you have to think about the dynamics of the electricity sector in order to make sure the let's say the benefit from the cost reduction is experienced by the consumer. And I would be saying that as the technology, you know, as different countries buy more and more of this technology, the price is dropping even generally. So I would say that, you know, maybe over the next 10 years, the consumer will see a benefit. My view is, how much of a benefit will the consumer see? So with the price drops, you could be thinking, if things continue in a business as usual approach, they may only get 5% of a drop in price, but there's the potential to be much higher, even up to 60-70%. And it's how that market is built and structured into the future. And that's where I think this type of future proofing in decision making, that, you know, the decision making around how the market develops has to change. You know, those who are that risk reward responsibility issue, that needs to change, and there needs to be a much clearer way of how individual consumers are going to benefit. If we want to buy-in from all the consumers, we have to show them how they're going to benefit into the future. And in many countries, unfortunately, due to the way the market is set up, consumers will have to generally experience, let's say, some pain before they actually begin to see the benefits, because there is that notion that some of these clean energy sources are more expensive, and, you know, some extra costs have to be attached onto them, such as, you know, some type of grid development charge. So I think it's an area that needs to be closely monitored, and it needs to really get behind this idea of strategic decision making and how it's going to deliver more just outcomes in the electricity sector. And my own view is that the European, you know, what's been happening in the European Union has not been very fair for the consumer for, you know, for many years. And let's say, I'm not overly hopeful of the policy changing too fast. In terms of the EU, that we have to hope that some individual countries can show different ways forward in terms of achieving lower prices for consumers. And then the final question around the ratings agency, I mean, and let's say access to finance, and let's say that was, you know, that was one of my points in that if we're to think into the future, you know, as we progress on the energy and climate transition, two of the areas that I highlighted that need a lot of work are around access to finance, and also, let's say, the view of let's say debt, and the debt of each country, which, and obviously both that would affect your rating, etc., as well. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in these areas, because currently, I think you know, there is a lot of criticism of the ratings agencies already, and you know, those views are excuse me, those views are well documented in the literature. So I won't mention them in detail, but what I would say is these areas need more work into how they are going to deliver on improving just outcomes for society. There is some work being done on trying to capture those more and ensure that it's more fair and the access to finance is more fair. But I think there are other tools to try and unfortunately, I don't think one can wait too long for the ratings agencies to improve maybe some of their mechanisms, but I think there are other ways of countries showing how they are, let's say, open and attractive for investment, and they could use some of those tools to try and accelerate investment into their country.
Fabulous. Thank you. I think we've got time for another round of questions. And I just want to acknowledge Santosh Sugrim's commentary in the chat. The cost of renewable energy has gone down as evidenced by the decreased tariffs in the REI4P by over 60% for wind and over 80% for PV. These tariffs are publicly available, as is the cost of the power sold to the utility. The reason that these costs are not passed to the consumer is varied, but lies with the increased cost from the utility due to increased maintenance, inflation, cost recovery for subsidized electricity, etc. Affordability of electricity is something that must be looked at by the relevant ministry and the regulator to ensure that these savings are passed down to the consumer. So thank you, Santosh, for that comment. Okay, are there any other, if you could put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. And while you do that, I have a question, although I think it's more of a provocation, Raphael. So my provocation comes from recent work I've done on water and the just transition. And it builds on this excellent book by Matthew S. Henry, Hydro Narratives, Water, Environmental Justice and the Just Transition. And the water transition is obviously, we don't have as much choice as we do with the energy transition because climate change-induced changes in the hydrological cycle are already taking place. There are a whole lot of other drivers around, water being less available that have to do with migration, aging infrastructure, the contaminants that we're putting into the water, and so on. The question I want to ask, though, is, this focus on future-proofing, is it sufficient as a kind of epistemological framework for justice where we have to really understand what happened in the past? And that is something that this book really, really highlights, that, we're in this situation today, which has to do with the way we've used energy, but the way we've used all sorts of resources. And the great acceleration that we've experienced since the Industrial Revolution comes from a logic of extraction, a logic of expendability, creation of sacrifice zones, and a politics of abandonment. And together with that, I'd add a kind of a logic of we're taking from the resource more than what it can sustain and more than what it can do to generate itself. And we're putting excrement back. So there's a kind of logic of excrement, which is what is driving climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's these logics that come from a real understanding of what happened in the past and accountability for that. And often that went with, genocidal occurrences, events, subordinations of whole nations of people. And now we are being asked to kind of future-proof our decisions. But we need to have a very grave and, a somber understanding of what happened in the past so that we don't repeat that. And the key principal thing for me as part of a justice framework is that there's a recognition that we need to kind of replenish. It's a principle of replenishment. So how does that feature in, this idea of future-proofing? That was just my provocation. So before you answer, let's just see if there are any other hands. I think there might be a few more hands. Oh, I've lost my participants. Any other hands? Well, there's just something that Okay, just in the chat. Okay, I think that maybe if you could just answer that, and then we can wrap up because people are already starting to abandon us.
Yeah. So I think actually your question, it also relates to, let's say, one of the questions, I think by Penny, but also by the comment from Santush that, you know, when we think of the price drops, and then the utility provider doesn't pass them on because there are various issues such as increased maintenance costs, inflation, different forms of cost recovery for subsidized electricity, etc. But what we need to remember here is that there is a legacy, for me, the legacy issue, which I think is what you're highlighting, that when we think of the energy transition and we think of these newer energy technologies coming into the system, we are actually nearly making these newer energy technologies pay like a legacy charge, that they have to contribute a greater contribution to the community to try and ensure greater community development. They have to pay, a higher maintenance charge to the grid, or even if it's within the same company, they're paying the maintenance charge on the old fossil fuel producing infrastructure. So wherever you look at it, the cost, this legacy cost, makes clean energy look more expensive, and as a result, people question: do we need to move on this energy transition because we have had this system and for so long? And I suppose if even if you look at many developed countries, they actually show that by having markets, there was a reluctance to build any new energy infrastructure because it was easier to use the existing electricity infrastructure and just charge a higher price. So, there was it's a process, I suppose they call asset sweating, and there was no reason to build any new infrastructure without being clearly incentivized. And now that we've given incentives, we're trying to address this legacy problem of how the market essentially operated in the past. And let's say in relation to that point, I think for me, that's why, let's say, one of the areas of justice that I've spent more time focusing on recently is the idea of restorative justice. And what I have held in the past is that restorative justice is actually there from the start, because you need to correct things from the very start. You need to acknowledge that, let's say, whatever point you decide to bring in new policy, regulation, law, incentives, whatever point you try and make a new decision, you need to acknowledge, well, this is the existing system, and where are those areas in the existing system that we need to, restore properly. And that's why I say what you find in most systems today is that, let's say, the good technology is ending up paying for the bad decisions of the past. So we are nearly there's nearly an ongoing price distortion. And what we should be asking is, where did all those profits of the past go? And I think that's the idea behind this future proofing, that we're not allowing so much of the profits to disappear from the system before we know what the full impact is going to be, or before we know that each stakeholder shared shared in the reward. And I think it is a disappointing experience in many countries where overall we can see the price drop, but it isn't passed on to the consumer. So I hope that touches on the answer to your question. I agree with you, and I think that's why that issue of restorative justice is, and it's an area that some American researchers and also myself have highlighted that it needs to be, it's one of the forms of justice or a principle of justice that you need to bring in at the very outset of when you're let's say, informing your decision-making process.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so with that, Raphael, thank you for an engaging discussion, also bringing us up to speed with some of the latest developments on the just transition work. I see Santosh has got another comment on this. Yeah, really appreciate the time and look forward to many, many more discussions about the development of these principles of justice in this very, very important area of the energy transition, but then also in other transitions. So with that, I'm going to close. And thank you everyone for your participation and your interest in this matter. And as Professor Heffron has very generously shared his email, it's there. Is it in the chat, Raphael?
I'll just put it in the chat.
Yeah, so if you want to engage with him further, get some of the publications that he has mentioned. By the way, I think that renewable energy and the legacy charge sounds like a great idea for a new article. But thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy your Monday further. Sorry, your Tuesday further.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.